The first light of dawn was a liar. It painted the valley in soft gold and rose, a beautiful lie that hid the circle of death surrounding Elias Blackwood's cabin. The first thing he saw was not the sun, but the glint of it on a rifle barrel, then another, and another, until the entire horizon around his crumbling, dust-choked property was a silent, shimmering necklace of steel and war paint. 200 Apache warriors. They sat motionless on their painted horses, a living, breathing wall of muscle and quiet judgment. There was no war cry, no shouted threat that would have at least given his fear a shape to fight against. This was worse. This was the chilling, absolute silence of a decision already made, a fate already sealed. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. This was the price. The final brutal interest on the debt of a single moment of kindness. He had expected a quick death from a raiding party of 5 or 10. But this was an army. This was an execution. His mouth dry as the dust on his floorboards, Elias peered through a splintered crack in the shutter, his world reduced to the narrow slice of view. The warriors were young and old, their faces streaked with the stark lines of war paint, their eyes holding a focus that saw nothing but the cabin and him inside it. At the very front of the formation, sitting astride a powerful black stallion, was a man Elias had only heard described in terrified whispers around dying campfires. Chief Gayaten. His hair was streaked with silver, but his posture was that of a man in his prime, a leader who had carved his people's safety out of a bloody frontier with sheer force of will. And he held no weapon. Instead, cradled in his hands like something sacred, was a long, intricately carved pipe, its stone bowl wrapped in a strip of pristine white fur that glowed in the early light. The symbol made no sense. It was an object of counsel, of peace. But the 200 armed men surrounding him told a different story. And then Elias's gaze fell on the figure standing beside the chief's horse, Chenoa. She stood tall and unwavering, the morning breeze tugging at her dark hair. The bandage on her arm was clean and white, a stark contrast to the deep earth tones of her clothing. Her eyes, dark as polished obsidian, found his through the narrow gap in the wood. They held no fear, no apology for the army she had brought to his home. Instead, they held a deep, unreadable resolve, a grim acceptance that sent a fresh, colder chill down his spine than any threat of violence ever could. The choice he had made yesterday, a simple, desperate act of mercy, had not just brought death to his doorstep. It had brought a terrifying, incomprehensible puzzle, and he was the only piece that didn't fit. The man Elias Blackwood had been just one sunrise ago, felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He stood in the yard, the dust from a failed world settling on his worn boots, and watched the heat shimmer over the graves of his ambitions. This patch of Texas ground had promised prosperity, but all it had delivered was a masterclass in loss. The bank in Santa Fe had taken his savings with a polite, unforgiving letter. The 2-year drought had taken his cattle, leaving their bleached bones to punctuate the barren fields. All that remained was this shack of a cabin, a roof that leaked despair, and Serenity. Serenity, his old sway-backed mare, was his last tether to anything resembling a future. She was his legs, his means to get to town for supplies that grew scarcer each month. She was his last asset, worth more than the land itself. She was everything, and as he looked at her, he knew she wouldn't last the winter. He was a man watching the final grain of sand trickle through the hourglass. It was the vultures that broke his self-pity, a slow, patient black circle in the bleached sky, a half-mile down the dry creek bed. A grim beacon, every instinct he had left, every survival nerve that hadn't been numbed by failure, screamed at him to look away. Trouble in Apache territory is a white man's death sentence. Turn around. Go inside. Tend to your own slow death. This is not your war. This is not your problem. But a deeper pull, the same stubborn, foolish decency that had made him a terrible businessman but had let him sleep at night, urged his feet forward. That decency had been a liability on the frontier, but he couldn't switch it off. It was the core of him. The walk felt like a mile. The creek bed was a jagged scar in the earth. And there, lying half in the shade of a rock, half in a pathetic trickle of muddy water, was the source of the vulture's interest. A woman. Her dress, though torn and dusty, was unmistakably Apache, decorated with faded patterns that spoke of a culture he didn't understand. Even unconscious, her face was striking, carved with high cheekbones and a quiet dignity that even the dirt and pain couldn't erase. A deep, ugly gash ran from her shoulder down her arm, the flesh around it swollen, angry, and pulsing with a feverish heat that he could feel from a foot away. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. She was dying right here in the middle of nowhere. Elias's mind became a battlefield more brutal than any range war. Leave her. This is your chance. No one saw you. Take Serenity, ride south, and start over. To help her is to invite a war party to your door. It is suicide. It is the end of everything. It was the smartest, most rational choice. He turned and looked back toward his cabin, a pathetic silhouette of failure against the vast, unforgiving sky. He looked at the dust, the emptiness, the profound silence of a life winding down. Then he looked back at this stranger, this enemy, fighting for one more single, ragged breath in the dirt. She was someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother. And in that moment, the choice was absurdly simple. It wasn't complicated at all. The cost would be unbearable. But the alternative, riding away and becoming the kind of hollow man who could leave another human being to the birds, was a different kind of death altogether. With a sigh that seemed to come from the worn-out soles of his boots, Elias Blackwood knelt in the dust. He gentled his hands, the hands of a failed rancher, and carefully, so carefully, gathered the wounded Apache woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He turned his back on the vultures and carried her, step by deliberate step, back toward the one thing he had left in the world, his crumbling, worthless cabin. The cabin, which had felt so empty and silent for months, was now filled with the sound of another human being's struggle to live. Elias laid the woman on his narrow cot, the rough wool blankets a stark contrast to her feverish skin. He worked with a frantic, focused energy he hadn't felt in years. This was a problem he could understand. Not drought, not debt, but a wound, a fever. A life hanging in the balance. He used the last of his precious whiskey, a bottle he'd been saving for a death that had now arrived in a different form, to clean the gash on her arm. She stirred but didn't wake, a low moan escaping her lips. Her skin was like fire. He ripped a clean strip from his only spare shirt for a bandage, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the task. He was all she had. Hours passed. The sun climbed, beating down on the roof. Elias stayed by the cot, dribbling water onto her lips, watching the slow, ragged rise and fall of her chest. As evening fell, painting the single room of the cabin in orange hues, her eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a terrified girl. They were the eyes of a woman, dark and intelligent, and they scanned the room with a swift, assessing clarity before locking onto his. There was no scream, no panic, just a deep, wary understanding of her situation. She tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp, first in a language he didn't understand, then in broken, heavily accented English. "You take me from the creek." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elias simply nodded, handing her a cup of water. She drank slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "I am Chenoa," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. She gestured weakly to her arm. "The Comanche. They ambush our hunting party. Was separated." She fell silent, the effort of speech exhausting her. But in those few words, she had laid out a map of the danger he was now in. This wasn't just an injured woman. She was a casualty of a frontier war. For 2 days, a strange, quiet rhythm settled over the cabin. Elias tended to her wound, which slowly began to show signs of healing. He made thin broth from his dwindling supply of salted meat, and she accepted it with a quiet nod of thanks. They spoke little, but a fragile, unspoken bond formed in the silence. Two survivors stranded on the same sinking ship. He was a broken rancher. She was a wounded warrior. The world outside had been cruel to them both. On the morning of the third day, Chenoa was able to sit up. She moved to the single window, looking out over the barren land. Her expression was grim. "You are alone here," she observed, not turning to look at him. "Yes," Elias replied. There was no point in lying. "This is bad," she said softly. "When I do not return, my people will come looking. They will find my trail. It will lead them here." She finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a new urgency. "If they find me here with a white man, they will not ask questions. They will see a captive. They will see a threat. They will kill you. And maybe me." The reality of his situation, which he had pushed aside to focus on survival, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He had saved her life only to place them both in greater danger. "What choice do I have?" he asked, the hopelessness of his position tightening his chest. Chenoa pointed toward the distant, jagged peaks on the horizon. "You must take me to the Three Sisters Rocks. It is the edge of my people's territory. If you leave me there, I can signal them. I can explain what happened. It is the only way." Elias stared at her. The Three Sisters were a full day's ride away. On Serenity, his Serenity, the plan was a death sentence in 2 parts. First, he would have to give up his horse, his last possession, his only means of escape from this dead land. He would be stranded on foot, a sitting duck. Second, even if he did it, there was no guarantee her people would believe her story. They could still decide he had taken her and hunt him down for sport. It was then that the first complication arrived, not from the ground, but from the sky. The air changed. The wind, usually a dry whisper, picked up, carrying a sharp, metallic scent. Elias stepped outside. To the west, the sky was no longer blue. A massive, bruised purple wall of cloud was rolling toward them, swallowing the horizon. It was a Texas thunderstorm, the kind that could turn a dry creek bed into a raging torrent in minutes. Chenoa joined him in the doorway, her face pale. "The storm. It comes fast. The creek will flood," she was right. The cabin sat in a slight dip in the land, right next to the creek. A flash flood would wash it away, and them with it. The immediate danger of nature overrode the distant danger of man. Without a word, they began to work together. Elias dragged sandbags he'd futilely made during the drought to the cabin's foundation. Chenoa, despite her weakness, helped stack them, her movements efficient and strong. They worked in tandem, a desperate, wordless partnership against the approaching fury. For a few hours, the threat of warriors was forgotten, replaced by the primal need to secure their shelter against the coming deluge. The storm hit with biblical force. Rain lashed the cabin walls like gunfire. The creek, moments ago a trickle, became a roaring brown monster, clawing at the banks just feet from their door. But the sandbags held. Inside, by the light of a single lamp, Elias and Chenoa waited out the storm. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin, the howl of the wind, and the shared understanding that they had, for now, survived together. When the rain finally ceased and the sun broke through the retreating clouds, a false sense of peace settled over the valley. The air was washed clean. They stepped outside to survey the damage. The land was a quagmire, but the cabin stood. It was then that Chenoa's hand shot out, gripping Elias's arm with surprising strength. She wasn't looking at the mud. She was staring, motionless, at the eastern horizon, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Elias," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear he hadn't heard in her before. He followed her gaze. The storm had cleared the air, making the distance sharp and clear. And there, on the far ridge, tiny as insects but unmistakable in their purpose, were several distinct plumes of dust. Riders, not a few, many. And they were moving fast. Chenoa's words from earlier echoed in the sudden, chilling silence. They will come looking. The first complication had passed. The second, far more deadly one had just appeared on the horizon. The dust plumes on the ridge coalesced into distinct figures, and the insect-like specks grew into mounted warriors. There were not just a few scouts. Elias's breath hitched as he counted. 20, 30. More were appearing over the rise. This was not a search party. It was a war band inside. "Now," Chenoa said, her voice low and commanding. She pulled him back into the cabin. her earlier weakness gone, replaced by a warrior's instinct. She slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door, plunging the single room into a dim, defensive gloom. The only light came from the cracks in the shutters, cutting the darkness into sharp, slanted lines. Elias's heart was a drumbeat against his ribs. This was it. The consequence he had been dreading since the moment he lifted her from the creek bed. He moved to the window, peering through a knothole. The warriors fanned out with a disciplined, terrifying efficiency. They did not charge. They did not yell. They simply took up positions, encircling the cabin at a distance of about 100 yards. Well within rifle range, but far enough to show they were not yet committing to an assault. It was a display of power, a silent announcement that there was no escape. "What are they waiting for?" Elias whispered, his throat tight. Chenoa stood at the other window, her profile sharp against the sliver of light. "For their leader, for Chief Kayaten, my brother." The word landed like a physical blow, brother. He hadn't just saved a woman. He had saved the sister of an Apache war chief. The situation was infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more complex than he had ever imagined. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. "Your brother. Will he listen to you? Will he believe you?" Chenoa turned from the window, her face a mask of grim realism. "He is a fair man, but he is also a chief. He must think of the tribe. If he believes you have dishonored me or taken me captive, his sense of justice will demand your life. My words may not be enough." She looked at the barricaded door. "We must wait. We must show no aggression. Any shot you fire will be the last sound you ever make." So they waited. The silence from outside was deafening. Elias could hear the soft snort of a horse, the creak of leather, the faint jingle of a bridle. These small sounds were somehow more menacing than shouts would have been. He checked his rifle for the third time. He had 12 rounds, against 30, 40, perhaps 50 warriors. The math was a sick joke. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Then a new sound reached them, the steady, rhythmic beat of a single drum. It was a slow, solemn tempo that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. "He is here," Chenoa said, her posture straightening. Through the knothole, Elias saw the circle of warriors part. A single rider advanced. It was the man from his dawn vision, Chief Kayaten. He rode slowly, with an immense dignity, the ceremonial pipe held crossways on his saddle. He stopped exactly halfway between the warriors' line and the cabin. He did not dismount. He simply waited, his gaze fixed on the door. "He offers a parley," Chenoa interpreted. "To come out alone, to stop there. It is a sign he is willing to talk. But it is also a test of your courage." Elias's hands were slick with sweat. To go out there was to walk into the open, unarmed, before the eyes of dozens of warriors. It was a gamble on a thread of hope. If I go out there and he decides I am guilty, what happens? Chenoa met his eyes. "It will be quick. But if you do not go, they will burn the cabin with us inside. There is no choice, Elias. This is the path." The truth of her words was absolute. There was no hiding from this. The choice to help her had set him on this road, and every step had led to this moment. He had faced the failure of his ranch, the emptiness of his future. Now he had to face the consequence of the one good thing he had done. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elias Blackwood made his decision. He carefully leaned his rifle against the wall. A show of trust, or a surrender. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. He lifted the heavy wooden bar and set it aside. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He pulled the door open just enough to slip through, then closed it behind him, leaving Chenoa inside. He would face this alone. The morning sun was bright after the darkness of the cabin. He stood on his porch exposed. He could feel the weight of 200 eyes upon him. He forced his hands to stay at his sides, not to raise them in a gesture that could be seen as weakness or threat. He walked forward, each step an eternity, until he was 10 feet from Chief Kayaten's horse. The chief was even more imposing up close. His face was a landscape of wisdom and hardship. His eyes dark pools that seemed to see right through Elias's skin, down to the fear and the futile hope tangled in his soul. The chief did not speak immediately. He simply studied Elias, taking his measure in the crushing silence. Finally, the deep, resonant voice broke the stillness. "You are Elias Blackwood." It was not a question. It was a statement of identification, of fact. The chief knew his name. "I am," Elias replied, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast space. "You saved the life of my sister, Chenoa." Again, a statement. There was no anger in the tone, no gratitude. Only a flat judicial recitation of events. She was wounded. "I helped," Elias said, sticking to the simple, undeniable truth. "You gave your last horse to carry her to safety. You stranded yourself to save an Apache woman." The chief paused, his gaze intensifying. Why, this was the question. The one everything hinged on. Elias's mind raced through a dozen answers, smart answers, cowardly answers. "I was afraid. I hoped for a reward. I didn't think." But standing there, under the gaze of this man who represented a law older than any sheriff's, only the bare, unvarnished truth would suffice. He thought of his empty life, his dead dreams. He looked the chief in the eye. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. And this time his voice was stronger, steadied by the conviction of the words. "I have lost almost everything. I know what it is to have nothing left. I could not let her have nothing, not even her life." Chief Kayaten's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of, not approval but perhaps assessment. He glanced back toward his warriors, then to the cabin door where Chenoa now stood watching, having stepped outside to witness the confrontation. The chief looked back at Elias, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the clearing, meant for all to hear. "Among our people there is an old law, a law from a time before the white man, before the fighting. The law of the ultimate sacrifice." Elias's blood ran cold. The words sounded final, judgmental. "It is a law that acknowledges a debt that cannot be repaid with horses or blankets," the chief continued, his hand resting on the ceremonial pipe. "When a person gives everything they have, their last possession, their last hope for their own survival, to save the life of another, without expectation of reward, a bond is created. A debt of spirit," he gestured toward Chenoa. "My sister is a widow. Her husband, a brave warrior, was killed by the same Comanche who wounded her. She now has no protector within the tribe." His eyes swept over Elias's threadbare clothes, the dilapidated cabin behind him. "And you have no family. You have no future here. The white man's world has broken you and cast you aside." The accuracy of the statement was like a physical blow. Elias could only stand there, waiting for the axe to fall. "The law states," Chief Kayaten's voice rose, formal and absolute, "that a life saved at such a cost must be bound to the life it saved. The debt is paid not with goods but with union, with family." He paused, letting the ancient heavy words settle on the quiet valley. "Elias Blackwood, we have not come for war. We have come with a proposal." The chief leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding Elias's, delivering the line that would shatter and rebuild his world in a single, breathtaking instant. "You will marry Chenoa." The words hung in the air, so absurd, so impossible, that for a moment Elias thought the heat and the fear had finally stolen his sanity. "You will marry Chenoa." He stood frozen, his mind refusing to process the statement. He looked from the chief's impassive face to Chenoa's. She did not look surprised. She had known. This was the resolution she had understood when she saw the ceremonial pipe at dawn. Her expression was not one of joy or romance, but of solemn acceptance. This was not a proposal of the heart. It was a verdict of tradition, a binding of fates by a law as unyielding as the desert rock. "Marry," Elias finally managed to whisper, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. I don't understand." Chief Kayaten's gaze was unwavering. "The law of the ultimate sacrifice is clear. You gave your last possession, your final hope of survival, for my sister's life. This act cannot be repaid with a gift of horses or land. To do so would be to cheapen it, to make it a transaction. The only currency equal to such a sacrifice is a life itself. Your life bound to hers." He gestured to the surrounding warriors. My people have seen white men take many things from us. Our land, our game, our freedom. But we have never seen a white man give his last horse to save an Apache woman. This act, it does not fit the world we know. It is either the act of a fool, or the act of a man with a spirit that is not like the others. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. The law exists to honor such a spirit, but it also exists to test it. Elias's mind raced, the implications crashing down on him like waves. A test? What test? The test of acceptance. Chenoa spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the clearing. She stepped forward to stand beside her brother's horse. To agree to this is to leave your world behind, Elias. To become one of us. To live by our laws, to protect our people. To be a husband to me in name and in duty. 'Tis to accept a new family, a new life, in exchange for the one you lost. And if I refuse? Elias asked, the question leaving his lips before he could stop it. The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. Chief Kayaten did not look angry. He looked disappointed, as if a promising theory had been disproven. If you refuse, the chief said calmly, it proves that your sacrifice was not pure, that you expected something else in return, that you are, after all, like the other white men, calculating. You would be free to go. Your horse would be returned to you, but you would be marked. Your name would be known among our people as one who offered a gift with a closed hand. No Apache would ever offer you help or water or shelter, no matter how desperate your situation. You would be truly alone in this territory. And that is a death sentence of a different kind. The choice was now horrifyingly clear. It was not between life and death, but between two different lives. One was a life of certain lonely extinction in the world he knew, a world that had already rejected him. The other was a life of immense challenge, of stepping into the complete unknown, bound to a woman he respected but did not love, under the watchful eyes of 200 warriors who would forever judge his worthiness. He looked at Chenoa. He saw not a bride but a partner. He saw the strength that had carried her through her wounds, the intelligence in her eyes, the fairness she had shown him. He thought of the empty cabin, the dust, the silence. He thought of the simple act of giving serenity away. In that moment, he hadn't been thinking of reward. He had only been thinking that he could not let a life be extinguished. That man, the man who had acted without calculation, was the best version of himself he had ever known. Chief Kayaten saw the shift in his eyes. The white man's world has given you nothing but failure, he said, not unkindly. It has broken you. We are not offering to fix you. We are offering to remake you. As a member of the tribe, as a protector of my sister, as a man with a purpose again. Elias's gaze swept over the circle of warriors. Their faces were no longer just masks of stoic threat. He saw curiosity there. He saw a flicker of the same assessment he saw in the chief's eyes. They were waiting to see what kind of man he was. He turned back to Chenoa. Is this what you want? He asked her directly, bypassing the chief, seeking the truth in the person whose life would be most intimately bound to his. Chenoa held his gaze. I want what is best for my people. I want to honor our laws and... She paused, choosing her words with care. I have seen your heart, Elias Blackwood. It is a good heart. In my world, that is more valuable than any ranch. This is not the marriage of white storybooks. It is a partnership, a treaty between two people sealed by a sacrifice. I accept this path. The question is, can you... In that moment, the last of his resistance crumbled. She was not asking for love. She was offering belonging. She was offering a place. She was asking for courage. Elias Blackwood, the broken rancher, stood up straight. He squared his shoulders to Chief Kayaten and looked him directly in the eye. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now overshadowed by something else, a faint, terrifying, exhilarating spark of hope. I accept, he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent clearing. I will marry Chenoa. A ripple of motion went through the warriors. It wasn't a cheer, but a collective shift in posture. A nodding of heads, a subtle relaxation of bows. The tension that had held the valley in a vice grip for hours suddenly broke. Chief Kaya-ten allowed himself a small, grave smile. He raised the ceremonial pipe high above his head, a signal to all. "Then the debt is settled," he announced, his voice echoing with finality. "The sacrifice is honored. From this day, Elias Blackwood is no longer a white stranger. He is to be my brother by law. He is to be a member of our tribe." The crisis was over. The siege had ended not in bloodshed, but in a bond stronger than any treaty. Elias felt a hand on his arm. It was Chenoa. Her touch was firm, not tender, but it was a connection. It was the first touch of his new life. "Come," she said softly. "There is much to prepare." As he turned to follow her back toward the cabin, the circle of warriors began to dismount. The sounds were no longer of a war party, but of a community setting up camp. The threat was gone, replaced by a bustling, purposeful energy. Elias looked at his cabin, no longer a prison or a tomb, but the threshold of everything that was to come. He had given his last horse and received a family in return. The proposal he couldn't refuse had been the key to a door he never knew existed. The marriage ceremony was unlike anything Elias could have imagined. It was not held in a church or a courthouse, but under the vast open sky of the valley he had once considered his prison. As the sun reached its zenith, the entire tribe gathered in a great circle around a central fire that had been lit for the occasion. The atmosphere was not one of romantic celebration, but of profound solemnity. This was a binding, a weaving of two lives into the fabric of a people. Elias was dressed in traditional Apache clothing provided by the tribe, soft deerskin trousers and a beautifully beaded tunic. He felt like an imposter, an actor in a play he didn't know the lines to. But when Chenoa emerged from a lodge, escorted by her brother, the feeling vanished. She was radiant, not in a soft bridal way, but with a fierce, undeniable dignity. Her dress was a work of art, white doeskin adorned with intricate blue and yellow beadwork that told the story of her family. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not love but a resolute partnership. It was a foundation he could build on. Chief Kaya-ten presided, his voice a steady drumbeat of ritual. The ceremony was a series of symbolic acts. They shared water from the same gourd, signifying they would now share life's sustenance. They exchanged gifts not of gold, but of purpose. Elias was given a finely crafted hunting knife, a tool for providing and protecting. Chenoa was given a seed pouch filled with corn, beans, and squash, symbols of her role in nurturing and building a home. Finally, they clasped hands, and the chief wrapped a single, beautifully tanned leather cord around their wrists, binding them together. "The cord is not a chain," Kaya-ten announced to the tribe. "It is a reminder that two strands, woven together, are stronger than one. You are now bound not by force but by choice and by honor. The debt is paid. The new path begins." As the cord was removed, a sound rose from the circle of warriors. Not a cheer, but a low, harmonious chant. It was a song of welcome, of acceptance. In that moment, Elias Blackwood, the failed rancher, ceased to exist. In his place was a man with a new name, a new family, and a future he could never have dreamed of. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The tribe did not simply leave. They stayed and they worked. The broken-down cabin was not abandoned. It was rebuilt, expanded, and fortified. The barren land, which had stubbornly resisted Elias's efforts, was approached with a different wisdom. The Apache knew how to read the earth, where to find water, how to plant in a way that respected the harsh climate. What was a failing ranch became a thriving homestead, a trading post, a neutral ground where the trust between two cultures was built not on paper treaties, but on the shocking decision of a chief and the daily actions of a man and a woman. Elias learned. He learned to hunt in the Apache way, with patience and respect for the prey. He learned their language slowly and clumsily at first, but with a determination that earned nods of approval. Chenoa, in turn, became the strategic mind of their new enterprise. Her intelligence, sharpened by her experiences in both worlds, made her a shrewd trader and a respected negotiator. The bond between them, born from sacrifice and duty, slowly deepened into a powerful respect and a quiet, steadfast affection. They were partners in every sense of the word. One evening, 6 months later, Elias stood on the porch of their new, sturdy home. The sound of laughter came from inside, where Chenoa was speaking with women from the tribe. The corrals, once empty, now held strong horses. The fields, once dust, showed the green shoots of a promising harvest. He looked out at the same valley that had once represented his utter defeat, and now it teemed with life and purpose. Chief Kaya 10 rode up, dismounting with the easy grace of a man half his age. He stood beside Elias, following his gaze. "You have done well, brother," the chief said, using the term naturally now. "We have done well," Elias corrected, a habit he'd learned from Chenoa. Kaya 10 smiled. "The law is satisfied, but more than that, it has proven wise. You have built a bridge here. Our young men trade here without fear. Your people come from distant towns to trade, and they leave with a different story about the Apache. They see we are not monsters. They see a man they once called a failure, who now stands tall because he understood a simple truth." "What truth is that?" Elias asked. "That sometimes to save your own life you must first be willing to give it away," the chief said. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You are no longer the broken rancher. You are a bridge builder, and that is a far greater thing." As the chief rode away, Chenoa joined Elias on the porch. She slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. They watched the sun set behind the distant Three Sisters rocks, painting the sky in shades of fire. "He is right, you know," Chenoa said softly. "You gave away your last horse and gained a herd. You gave up a dying patch of dust and received a fertile valley. You lost a world that did not want you and found a people who did." Elias looked at her, at the strong profile etched against the dying light. He thought of the long, lonely nights before she came, and the busy, purposeful days since. The proposal he couldn't refuse had been the greatest gift of his life. "I didn't find a people," he said, squeezing her hand. "I found a home." If you found yourself facing that impossible choice, what would you do? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story of sacrifice and redemption moved you, then you need to see the video on your screen right now. It's another incredible tale where a simple act of courage changes destiny forever. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that prove history's greatest lessons are written in the choices of ordinary people. Sometimes, the God asks for everything you have left. He asks for your last hope, your final possession. In that moment of ultimate sacrifice, when you choose compassion over survival, you don't end up with nothing. You make room for everything. The greatest strength is not in holding on, but in having the courage to let go.